Everyone, welcome to today's live stream. I have had several questions from my students and Goats 365 members in the last few days that really just begs the question, why is it so hard to raise goats? And so I have been thinking about this a lot over the last few days. I just got finished responding to another student's question in the parasite course about dewormer resistance. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about why it seems like it is so hard to raise goats. We have raised pretty much everything. We've sheep, cattle, horses, llamas, all the poultry, and goats. And I accidentally became a goat expert because that's what I had to do to keep my goats alive. So I very well could have been one of those people who after 5 years said, yeah, we quit raising goats because we couldn't keep them alive, or because I was spending hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars on vet bills and tons of supplements and tons of drugs. And, when people ask me, have you tried X? The answer is usually yes, I did. Like 15 or 20 years ago, I tried X because I was desperate, because I tried anything and everything that anybody told me might work to help keep my goats alive. So why is it so hard to raise goats compared to other animals? First of all, one of the mistakes that a lot of people make is that they buy the wrong goats. There is an old veterinary saying that most of your vet problems are bought and sold. And goats don't just, like, you don't bring in, healthy goats that suddenly get a bunch of diseases. So most people bring in their problems. This is an area where I initially got very lucky. Our problems would have been worse a lot sooner. Like the first 2 years was smooth sailing with our goats, like no problems. But in that second year is when I bought a buck that came from a farm that had resistance to Safeguard. And so that is when we lost our first goat, and he died from worms. And it was, and when I told, and it was like within 2 or 3 weeks after he arrived on our farm, he died from worms, which came from a necropsy. And when I told this person who sold him to me, she said, "Oh, well, everybody knows that Safeguard doesn't work," which is not true. Safeguard worked on my farm before I brought that goat on. It worked, with any other goat I had given it to. It was also the dewormer that my vet told me to use. And so, this, again, I have a whole video on why there is no such thing as dewormers that don't work across the board. It's a matter of what the worms are resistant to on your farm. So I brought in dewormer resistance. And at that point, because that was like 2004, at that point, the vets told me all the bad things, like they told me like, oh, start giving the goats a dewormer every month and use this dewormer. And they told me the wrong dosage. They told me the sheep dosage. And so within 2 years, we had 100% dewormer resistance across the board on our farm. Nothing worked. So I just sat there and watched my goats die. So it's really important that you not buy the wrong goats. So you need to make sure that you're buying goats from herds that are tested negative for diseases like CAE, CL, and Johne's, and not just one test. Like if you think, oh, I'm buying a couple kids, I'm gonna have these kids tested, that's no good. The whole herd needs to be tested negative. And when you bring in new animals, you don't just put them with all the rest of your animals, you put them in quarantine. I am actually, we've had a closed herd since 2005. We haven't bought any more goats. And when I do bring in a new buck every 4 or 5 years, those boys are in the barn for months. And I am not kidding you. And I'm watching them like a hawk. So the last bucks we bought were 2 or 3 years ago, and we bought them in July, and they did not leave the barn until after October. And so, because they came from a herd that was tested negative for all the diseases, but I also wanted to make sure they didn't have any parasite issues. And the only way you can do that is, and I didn't want them, like if they had any resistance to any dewormers, if they were carrying worms that had resistance, I didn't want them going out there and pooping those worms all over my pasture like that little buck did in 2004. Because then all my bucks wound up with worms that were resistant. And actually, it's like I lost that little buck in August, and then in December I lost 2 more bucks to worms, and I almost lost another one in January. So because back then nobody really had the kind of information that we needed to be able to control worms. Now we do. Unfortunately, nothing online ever dies, and so there's still a ton of old information that's getting passed around. So so number one is you need to make sure that you are buying healthy animals. I feel like this is a much bigger problem with goats than, a lot of people are coming to goats. They're their first livestock. Their experiences with dogs and cats. And usually you can get a dog and cat anywhere. You can get free dogs and cats, and they're usually not, well, first of all, you don't have a herd of them, so it's not like you're going to bring one in that's going to make all the rest of them sick. You bring one in, if it looks healthy, it's probably healthy. That is not true with goats. Goats can have, so like, this is why you need to buy from herds that test, because CAE, CL, and Yonis all are asymptomatic in the early stages, and some animals can remain asymptomatic forever. So, asymptomatic is a real thing. During COVID, people were like, if I was sick, I would know it. Well, no, like there are diseases that are asymptomatic. There are animals that get diseases that are asymptomatic, and they pass that disease on to other animals. So, I know somebody who had mycoplasma in her herd, and she never figured out the goat. She never figured out the typhoid Mary. That's the whole typhoid Mary cliche is typhoid Mary was giving typhoid to everybody, but she didn't have symptoms. So, that's the thing. A goat can bring a disease into your herd and look completely healthy. It may look completely healthy its whole life, and you will never know if you didn't test. So that's why it's really important to buy from herds that test, and then to keep testing so that that nobody's developed anything within the time since they arrived on your farm. So I have tons more information on all of that. So I am going to move on to number 2. So you buy all the right goats. Like I did, the first goats I bought were the right goats from somebody who'd been breeding for 20 years. They were very healthy. They were great. But I brought them home and I started feeding them incorrectly. So number 2 for why it is so hard to keep goats alive is that you're giving them the wrong diet. So again, this was 2002, and the goat feed that I purchased only had 10 ppm of copper in it. I don't know that you can even find a goat feed anymore that has copper that low. But back then, like I said, 2002, back in the 1990s, they still thought that goats and sheep were the same nutritionally. They thought that goats needed no copper. In fact, I know this because, last week I was talking about the difference between 4-H from one place to another. And our kids were in 4-H. And the goat information they gave us was from the 1990s. It's like this booklet was published like in 1995 or something, and so we didn't know. And also, you think like if for the most part you go buy a dog food, your dog's not going to die if you buy the wrong dog food. For most, your cats aren't going to die if you buy the wrong cat food. But I was buying the wrong goat food because it had very little copper in it. The other thing too is that I did not understand how important it was to have a mineral. I thought that minerals for goats were like a person taking a multivitamin, and that is absolutely not true, because goats, we do not have what goats need. So most people are trying to turn their goats into grazers, meaning that the goats, they put goats out on a pasture and expect them to do well. Goats are browsers. So if you have browse, your goats are going to do a lot better. Browse is bushes, small trees, things like that. Weeds. It's like stuff beyond grass. Sheep and cows are fine. They are grazers. So this is why, like, some of the people who have the hardest time raising goats are people who raise cattle, because they think that goats are just little cows, and they bring them in and they try to raise them like cows, and it's disastrous. The goats are dying left and right. And these are generally the people bringing in boars, which boars have a lot more problems with parasites. And it's just super challenging for cattle people to start raising goats and when they try to raise them like little cows, because they're not little cows. So feeding goats is really important. Goats have much higher mineral needs than sheep or cows do. And I can say this with a lot of certainty because for the first 5 years that we raised animals, the goats had a mineral that was refilled very sporadically because I didn't take it seriously. I didn't realize how important it was. The sheep and cows had nothing, okay? After 2 years, we had goats that were not getting pregnant, goats that were not staying pregnant, goats that were aborting. We never had a buck live past the age of 3. For the first 5 years, we had goats. How many sheep and cows did we lose during that time when they had no mineral available? 0, okay? So this is why I can say with such certainty that minerals are so much more important for goats than they are for sheep and cows. If you try to raise your goats like your sheep and your cows, it's not going to work. You're going to say that goats are too hard. And they're not hard. You just have to know what to do. You just have to make sure that you're giving them a goat mineral, not a sheep and goat mineral. It is so frustrating to me that it is 2023 and that companies still have sheep and goat minerals for sale, because people are new and they think, oh, I've got sheep, I've got goats, I'll get the sheep and goat mineral. And that doesn't work. You will wind up with goats that are copper deficient. I am helping somebody right now who has that problem. So you can't do that and expect to have healthy goats because they need a lot more copper. And so the wrong diet is just disastrous. The other issue I see is people still buying blocks. You can't give goats a block. Number one, 95% of the blocks I have seen don't have the minerals in them that goats need. 95% of blocks are almost entirely salt with tiny, tiny little amounts of the important stuff like copper and selenium. So you've got a block, which is very hard. Goats have a small, soft tongue, not a big sandpaper tongue like cows. Anybody raise your hand if you've ever been licked by a cow, okay? They have massive sandpaper, like really tough sandpaper tongues. That's who blocks are for. They're not for goats that have this soft little tongue. And then, so on top of that, so even the best block, even if there is like one block I know of that matches a loose mineral, but a goat's not going to be able to get the minerals they need from that because their tongue is soft and small. So if you've got a block, the goats can't get enough off of it. But the more frustrating thing is that most of those blocks are like 90-95% salt. And when you look at the level of minerals in them, it is minuscule. Okay, like we're talking like 30 ppm copper. A loose mineral needs to have like at least 1700, 1800 ppm copper. So like you could put that block out there with sheep and they would never become toxic from the copper. Like they would be fine with it because they could never get enough copper off of it to make themselves sick. So a block is just a terrible idea. And it's very frustrating to me that they still sell blocks for goats. And that they sell sheep and goat minerals. And I refused to sell goats to someone one time because before she even had the goats, she was arguing with me. She's like, well, they wouldn't sell it if it wasn't good for them. And I'm like, okay, you are not getting my goats. And boy, did she get mad. She's like, you're not the only person who knows how to raise goats. And I'm like, no, but I want to make sure my goats go to a home where they're going to get the nutrition they need. And clearly you're not going to give it to them. So I'm not selling you my goats. So you've got to be not afraid. And I'm sure she found somebody who didn't care and didn't ask. And, so she got goats and gave them a sheep and goat mineral and gave them products that were not going to be helpful for them. So, number 3. So number 1 was buying the wrong goats. Number 2 was the wrong diet. Number 3, the reason that it is so hard to raise goats is incorrect management. And I really blame this on the fact that most of us have been to zoos many times in our lives, at least a few times growing up. And you go to a zoo and you see animals, usually in pretty small enclosures. And you don't usually see empty enclosures. If you do see an empty one, there's a sign there that says, these animals are off getting bred at another zoo or something like that. Like it's obvious that it's temporary. So like every single enclosure at a zoo has animals in it. And so this leads people to think that you bring your animals home and you put them in the pasture and forget about them. Like that's it. You put them in there and they're good. And that is not how it works with goats. So, like I said, goats are not grazers. That means, so historically through time, goats did not develop the kind of parasite resistance that sheep and cows have. Sheep and cows have been eating off the ground forever. Goats have not. Goats have been eating out of the trees. They've been eating off the bushes. There's no worm larva in the leaves because the goats are not pooping in the leaves. Like that seems so obvious once somebody points it out to you. I asked a vet professor this a long time ago when we were having a problem, and he's like, goats are browsers and we're trying to turn them into grazers and they just can't do that. So they're not getting the nutrition they need. Number one, because the grass isn't as high in minerals as browse. And number two, the grass is covered with parasite larvae. So this is why if you have goats, if you put them on, if you put the goats on pasture, they have to be rotated. I tell people, if you leave goats on grass, they are eating out of their toilet. Do you think you would be healthy if you were eating out of your toilet? Probably not. So you can't expect your goats to be healthy if they're eating out of their toilet. So you want to make sure that you are moving them to fresh grass before the parasite eggs hatch and become infective larvae. I go into this in huge detail in my parasite course about what that means, because the timing on rotation is going to vary from season to season. It depends on what state you're in, what you've got on your pasture. Like the answer, this is like the biggest, it depends answer for anything that I talk about. Like the answer is often it depends when it comes to goats. But this is like one of the biggest, it depends. I can talk to somebody for 15, 20 minutes one-on-one to sort out like what they need to be doing for pasture rotation. But the bottom line is you got to get your goats off of that wormy pasture on a regular basis. This could be anywhere from every 5 days, worst case scenario, to every couple weeks. There's a lot of variables. But the bottom line is that you should not be giving your goats, you should not be giving more than 10% of your goats a dewormer every year. So that means if you have 10 goats, you should not have to give more than one of those goats a dewormer. If you've got 20 goats, you shouldn't have to give more than 2 of those goats a dewormer every year. And that means one time, okay? Like, so you've got 20 goats, 2 of the yearling does kid, because they're young, they just kidded, they've got that stress, their immune system is lowered. You see their FOMACHA score go down, their body condition score goes down, they start pooping logs, they're failing the 5-point check, so you give them a dewormer and you keep them off pasture until all of their symptoms improve, and then they're good. That's it. They don't get another dewormer for the rest of the year. In fact, I know a meat goat breeder, the second time a doe needs a dewormer, or a buck, the second time any breeding animal in her herd needs a dewormer, they go to the locker. Because she wants to have goats that have good parasite resistance. And we went from goats dying 15 to 20 years ago to today, like, yeah, 10%. That's it. Typically a yearling first freshener is like the only one. Occasionally our bucks will wind up needing a dewormer. Usually, sometimes it's because a human screwed up with the pasture rotation. But I've seen people who can quote all the FOMACHA information verbatim, but then they're deworming their goats like monthly. One of my Goats 365 members asked some, he bought a doe and 2 kids, and this woman, like, he sent me the information she sent him about her worm control. And it's like, wow, she could have written an article on smart deworming. But then she gave him this goat's records, the doe's records, and this doe had been dewormed every single month except for like December and January. Okay. She's in the Southeast United States. That is not, and like, this isn't a fantastic example of placebo. It's also a case of, I think, where this person doesn't have a FAMACHA card. So she's just guessing. But this is a fantastic case of placebo, because every month she thought that this doe was anemic. She gave this goat the same dewormer every month. She gave her 2 cc's of red cell, which research shows would not do anything at all to improve that goat's FAMACHA score. And she thought the goat was fine until next month. She thought the goat was anemic again. So she gave the goat another dewormer. So something is wrong. If more than 10% of your goats need a dewormer every year, then something's wrong. Either you're not rotating pasture, or you're overdiagnosing, or something like that. So it's very important that you understand that goats should not be hard to raise. And if you are having trouble, it's because something's not right. Either you bought the wrong goats, or the diet is wrong, or the management is wrong, or maybe all 3. And that's the hardest, that you bought goats that were not healthy, and then you're giving them the wrong mineral, and you're not rotating pastures. And so you take sick goats and you spend a fortune. And these are the people who often wind up getting rid of their goats, because they spend a fortune on vet bills and sit there and watch goats die. And they don't know why. So I saw we have a question that came in while I was talking. I hope you're still with us. Tommy so says, I'm amazed by the fees in my area. I've only had goats for a year. I currently have 2 with persistent coughs for a month now, but dry and no other symptoms that have recently gotten worse. My other 2 just started to cough as well, concerned about hitting the holiday and things escalating, or rather going downhill. I called to see about getting the closest reputable vet that sees goats. $100 travel fee, $175 an hour vet fee, $50 an hour assistant fee, and that does not include any treatment. So this is, so I hope you're still with us, because so I've got a few things that might help with that. Number 1 is take your goats into the vet office. You don't need to take all 4. If this is something, if it is something contagious, then, if you take in the 2 that started first, and see what they say is wrong with them. The other thing that you could do is, sometimes goats cough because they have lungworm, and that sounds scary, like, oh my God, lungworm. And some goats can have lungworm and they'll cough, but they don't ever get sick. And the reason they're coughing is because they're coughing up the larva. So they're so anyway, that could be it. So that could be it. And you have to get a Behrman fecal for that, because it is a standard fecal is only looking for worm eggs, and for lungworm, what you would be looking for is larva. So you could see if you can find a vet who will do a Behrman fecal in the area, and that you could just take in the poop to get that checked. Some vets will do that. Some vets some vets, well, actually, come to think of it, I think a lot of vets are probably going to, if they've never seen your goats, they might want to see the goats. So that would be an argument for taking the goats in. But then after that, follow-up fecals, you should definitely be able to just take the fecal in and have them check it for you. And the other thing is, we have a whole podcast episode on using university vet hospitals. University vet hospitals are a fantastic option for people. I wound up using one, and Tammy, who helps me answer questions on social media, also wound up using one, because Well, it's close to her. Texas A&M is half an hour from her. University of Illinois is 2 hours for me, and I gladly drive that now. I originally drove that distance because there was not a vet in my area who saw goats, so it was my only option. And the first time I went there was when I had goats for 2 years, and it was that buckling that died from worms. He died half an hour after I got him there, and after that, so that is where initially I had to take goats. Now I have two vets in my area that see goats, and I rarely call them because I have gotten so spoiled by the university. I take goats into the university, and they have specialists there. Like if I had a goat with an eye injury, they can call in an ophthalmologist. If you have a goat with a skin condition, they can call in a dermatologist. They have surgeons, they have anesthesiologists, they have all the specialists. They also have the lab. And so when I take a goat into the university, I know I am most likely going to have an answer within a couple hours because the lab is right there. Whereas if you see a local vet, they're going to have to mail in a lot of stuff like blood. They're going to have to mail in. Most vets, well, I shouldn't say most. It's fewer and fewer vets are doing fecals in-house. A lot of vets do still do fecals in-house. But blood, for sure, they're going to send that out to a lab. And so when I'm at the university, I always do that. And honestly, I don't think I would ever have a barn C-section. We have had 3 C-sections, and the third C-section, the C-section that we had a year and a half ago, the goat never would have survived if it was a barn C-section. Because you always, I've heard for 21 and a half years, I've heard that goats can have trouble with anesthesia and sedatives and stuff. And I had never seen it personally until that C-section. And so because at the university, there were 4 people there hands-on, 5 people there hands-on for the C-section. If you're in a barn, it's going to be your vet and you're the assistant. Maybe a few of them will have assistants with them, but not all of them. So there were 5 people there. And I think the least I've ever had there for a C-section was 3 or 4 for our second C-section. For the first C-section, there were 10. So it just kind of depends on the time of day and stuff. But for this last C-section, there were 5 people there, and there was a student monitoring vitals like constantly. And so when that goat's vitals plummeted, like she said it right away. She's like constantly checking blood pressure and everything, and heart rate and respirations. And when all of her vitals started to plummet, she said it. And there were 3 vets there. And one of the vets immediately went and got the medication that needed to be given to the goat at that time to help her. And then they checked her blood sugar and found out her blood sugar was sky high. So they gave her insulin. And actually a C-section at the University of Illinois, I think the C-section itself was only about $250, $300. Which is what it was for the first and second goats. And it would have been for this third goat if she hadn't tried to die on us because of her reaction to the anesthesia. And it took her, I want to say, about 3 hours to wake up from the anesthesia. And they were trying to give her medication to reverse the anesthesia, and it didn't. So like I said, big problem for her with the anesthesia. So it's really great. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. You're close to Virginia Tech. Yes. Dr. Stewart is at Virginia Tech. So Dr. Stewart is Tommy just commented in the comment section, they're close to Virginia Tech. I'm so excited for you because I know they have a fantastic sheep and goat section. Dr. Jamie Stewart is the person that I interviewed for all of my reproductive stuff. She literally wrote the book on goat reproduction. I found her because I was looking in Merck Vet Manual, and I saw that Dr. Stewart had written a section in there on a lot of the reproduction stuff. So that's why I originally contacted her to do the podcast a podcast on something reproductive. I don't remember what our first podcast was. She's been on 5 or 6 episodes now. They have got some great people at Virginia Tech who can help you with your goats. And I'm so excited. You're only 2 hours. I can tell you absolutely that you are in. It is so worth it. I have driven 2 hours for 3 C-sections in the last 21 years, and it was totally worth it. And every time, it's been totally worth it because the what they're able to do there is just amazing. Jennifer said, do you know of any universities that offer this in Ohio? So it would be basically, you would just need to Google Ohio Vet School. And I don't know. So you said you're in Northeast Ohio. So you're also close to Pennsylvania. I wonder if you're closer. Okay. I don't know exactly where these vet schools are. Penn State is where Dr. Van Son is. So Northeast Ohio makes me think you're close to Pennsylvania. So if you're closer to Penn State, let's see. And then I'm not sure. There used to be only 26 vet schools in the US. Not every state had one. We're getting more. I think we're getting closer to 30 now. So if you just Google Ohio Vet School, see what you find. Because every vet school, except for Alaska that I know of, Alaska does not have a 4-year vet school. Alaska has a 2-year program. So they don't have a clinic because it's the 4th years are the ones that do clinicals. And then there's a few 3rd years in there. But the first 2 years of vet school is all classroom. And so that's what they do in Alaska at the university there, is that they do the first 2 years in Alaska and then they transfer to Colorado State. So that's a dual program there. Cooperation between Alaska and Colorado. But otherwise, if you just Google the name of your state and vet school, see what you come up with. And then if you're close to the border of a state, then there may be a state closer to you. And we've got a whole, like I said, there's a whole podcast episode that Tammy and I did on using vet schools, because that's what we do. We basically, and I'm so jealous of her because she's only 30 minutes from Texas A&M. So it's very easy for her to take her goats there whenever she needs to. And so she's gotten amazing diagnostics from them also. Just like, I've gotten some really great insight from Illinois. So holy cow, this went long. I cannot believe it's 32 minutes. Thank you all for joining us. Yes, this is definitely replay. So it looks like you're on Facebook. So sometimes there's a few minutes before a live shows you the replay, but if you don't see it, so if you don't see the replay right away, it should just be a few minutes for it to finish processing. And then if you guys have any questions, feel free to post in the comment section below, and one of us will get back to you. Thanks so much. See you guys later. Bye for now.